Bird, bird is the word. Bird was recorded with Steve Wiese. How you doing, Steve?
I'm doing fine, Elliot. Surfin Bird, I think you're referring to.
Yeah, by the Trashman.
Yep.
Made by KBank Studios, which this isn't anymore. But
No, it was KBank back in the early 60s.
Sure. After it was a movie theater and after
Bruce Swedine. Bruce Swedine, who was famous, he was an iconic recording engineer, producer, I've often referred to as the Pope of recording engineers, because probably was the most famous and highly respected engineer back in a day when engineering was really, regarded as, very special.
Sure. Took a lot of talent, a lot of know-how.
And they were creating new things back then that hadn't been done previously, and instead of just relying on the computer and whatever plug-in you can buy.
Fix it all in post.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, Bruce and his father bought this building. It was built in 1914 to 15. It was called the Garrick Theater initially, and then in about 1926, I think it became the LaSalle Theater.
Cool.
And was the LaSalle Theater until, and that the company LaSalle Entertainment Company, I think, owned it, and they owned a number of neighborhood movie theaters, maybe a half a dozen of them. The Lindale Theater, Lake Street, Franklin Theater.
Little one screen with air conditioning.
Exactly.
Early types.
A place to go in the summer when it was hot outside. You could come in and cool off and see a movie for 18 cents. Later, it got really expensive, went up to a quarter. But this was a functioning movie theater until about 1951 or 2, I think, and then the building. The history in there is a little sketchy and indeterminate. People have different recollections, but
I've noticed that the years change slightly when you research this.
Yeah, for 20 years I had this great, brilliant, old school piano tuner. It would come. His name was Glenn Sipe.
Cool.
And Glenn said that there was a photographer that was in the front of the building. So between the time the theater closed and when Bruce Swedine poured the floor flat, more or less flat, in 1954, the photographer that was in the front of the building took he and his wife's wedding pictures. And then later, he became a piano tuner for me in this building. So
cool.
He had this flashback that went back, 40, 50 years.
Got to fill in some history for you.
Yeah.
Cool.
So at that period of time, about 52, 3, somewhere in there, the building was kind of vacant, and people, used the front, but they didn't use the back part. Where we're sitting now, basically, you're sitting behind the screen, and I'm sitting right about under it.
Okay, yeah, because you said this was the exact partition.
That would be the superstructure of the proscenium of the stage and theater, and when there was a little stage in here. And there actually used to be a little orchestra pit, little mini, more or less an organ pit, that was right about where the control room window is.
Oh, cool.
And it went down. So the organist, the old Lowry organist, probably sat down in there and looked up at the silent films and played along with it.
Scored Nosferatu or whatever.
Exactly. Cool. Metropolis. Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. So it was a silent theater and then a talkies theater, obviously, in the 20s, whenever talkies became a thing.
Sure.
But originally a silent movie theater, and there are stories that maybe that it was vaudevillian occasionally, where maybe some magicians would come here, or an occasional musician or something. There's a myth story about Harry Houdini, the great Harry Houdini, doing an act here at one point back in the 20s.
Oh wow! Escaping one of his straitjackets or something.
Yeah, exactly. But.
Cool.
There's no actual proof about it. There's just stories. There are a lot of stories about the place, but no one has said, here's a document, here's the playbill of the day when Harry Houdini performed here, or anything. But, the stories come down like that, just like religious stories come down through the ages. Some guy says, I'm going to write this down and hand it to my nephew, and he's going to pass it on to his kids. And that's how things happen. So the Harry Houdini story.
Cool. And then around that time, 1954 or 5, that's when Bruce Swedine got his hands on it?
Swedine, yeah, Bruce Swedine and his father. So you're aware that of the old Schmidt Music Building that was downtown on 10th Street.
Yeah.
10th and Marquette kind of, or 3rd or something.
Had all those music notes.
And it
inside.
had the big score on the side,
Yeah.
the whole sheet music score. Well, in that, and Schmidt Music, that was their headquarters for a long time. But they, up on the 4th floor, had a small control room. And then the 3rd floor was kind of a performing area. And they used to do radio broadcasts from up there and live performances. And so they had a couple of monotape machines, and maybe back in those days they had a 3-track machine, but it wasn't stereo. It was just 3, because they didn't have stereo consoles. They weren't doing any of that stuff, but you could have 3 tracks going.
Cool.
So Bruce and his father bought that equipment and then bought this building, and then came in and they poured the floor flat. And he and his wife Bee, they were about 21 or 22 years old or something at that point. They pasted up on the ceiling of the theater to somehow dampen the liveness of the theater.
Sure.
They pasted up about 10,000 sheets. They were egg sheets. Used to be able to go, I think they called them flats or something. You'd buy a flat of 24 eggs. Nowadays, we buy a dozen that folds over on the top, but those sheets used to be flat. And he said we pasted about 10,000 of them up. There's about probably 9,000 still up above all the false ceilings here in the studio.
The egg flat cartons?
That was his acoustic treatment long before Oralex and any other foam treatment. That's how and curtains, he had curtains along the walls, but the ceiling was hard, and so he wanted to damp that down.
Sure.
And so he stuck those up on the ceiling to kind of tame down the live reverberance of the room.
Okay, yeah, and then poured the concrete so it wasn't a slant as most theaters are.
Yeah, because there's probably where I'm sitting, you're over the old bathrooms, but where I'm sitting, there's probably 3 feet of concrete.
Jeez.
Because I asked Bruce about it, I said, we used to brought in a lot of dirt, gravel and stuff. He said, nah, we poured all concrete. He said, concrete was cheap.
Cool.
So yeah, it's sloped up to the ticket office, which is at the front door, and there used to be chandeliers that hung up there. Now I have some fans running, and there's a bathroom in the front of the building, and that used to be the ticket window. So you walk in the front door and go over to where the bathroom is, and there'd be somebody in there selling you a little red coupon for 18 cents or something.
Sure.
And you'd give them the money, they'd give you that, and they'd tear it in half. So then you had a half a stub, and that was if you wanted to come out, that was your way to get back in, kind of, and that's how they counted them.
Cool.
At the end of the night, they'd count, we sold 270, half stubs here, It was a good night.
Yeah. There you go. And then in the late 50s, he started working with astronauts who at that time were in weather balloons, and he was recording some of it.
Yeah,
something
Bruce,
like that, right?
Bruce was really interested in electronics back in those days, and I got to know him quite well and was good friends with him from 1995 until when he passed in 2020.
Cool.
So for 25 years, Bruce and I had a nice friendship, and we'd call each other on the phone. Mostly he'd call me, but I'd call him if I happened to be going wherever he lived, and then I'd go visit him. But he was very much into music. He liked choral music, he liked to sing, and his dad, I think, repaired organs or something. And so he got involved in electronics that way. And then he had studied music, liking to sing, so he could read music, and he got it because of his electronics curiosity. That brought his music and his electronics together into recording. And they had these tape machines, and then he got some microphones, and he would take them out and do a lot of the jazz bands out of Chicago and other places. They'd come around the Midwest and they'd play all the ballrooms, and Bruce would go out and he would record these shows. And they went back to people in Chicago at big studios there, and they said, damn, these are really good recordings. Who did this? Well, there's this kid in Minneapolis. Well, we should have him here in Chicago. And so they headhunted Bruce
Cool.
and brought him to Chicago. and he went to work in the studios, and then he wrote a couple books. His wife, Bee, who just passed away in February of this year, has a great new book out called My Life as a Studio Wife. And
cool, she wrote a book.
She wrote, well, she's two. Actually, I have an original manuscript of her first book. She was a very interesting woman, too. She grew up as the daughter of a minister, of a Lutheran minister in eastern India. You know, so in the wilds of India back in the, 20s, 30s, 40s, it was pretty, wild, and you'd get outside of the little village or whatever, and then you were in the middle of the jungle or whatever. Anyway, but she's from here and met Bruce here originally, but then went back and forth. But anyway, so they wound up moving to Chicago, and they were together for, I don't know how many years. I mean, from 1953 to 2020, they were married, 70 some years.
Sure. And then when he left for Chicago to work for the headhunters, the people that wanted him in the bigger studios
he
in
worked
Chicago.
at Universal. He met Bill Putnam,
Yeah, ended up working with Quincy Jones, Michael Jackson.
He met Quincy while he was there.
Okay.
And then he and Quincy had then a 50-year relationship. Everything that Quincy did, Bruce became his engineer. But
that's how he got the job.
Yeah. Because Quincy was this trumpet player in the big bands around there and was an arranger, and
sure, Sarah Vaughan.
The word spread around the Chicago studios that there's this new young guy and he's really good and we should get him.
Cool.
There weren't a lot of recording engineers in those days because there weren't a lot of studios. The record labels had the studios, and maybe there was one big independent place. And Chicago was famous for doing a lot of jingles, and so Bruce became a guy who was sought out. And that brought him, I mean, if you read Bee's book, I had no idea, and I knew him, personally for 25 years. I had no idea how many records that I was familiar with that he made, that he was the engineer, that he won a Grammy for or something. I mean, it's stunning that he had as long a career as he had, and then at the level that he was at, ultimately making, working with Quincy when they got the Michael Jackson, Off the Wall, Thriller, Bad, Dangerous.
The big record, yeah.
Yeah, lots. I mean, the records that Bruce recorded probably sold 200 million copies or something.
Yeah.
I don't know, but I mean, a lot.
Right.
And so he was a funny Swedish guy, he and his wife Bee, and they met the king and queen of Sweden. They were invited over. They were celebrities, because he got to be very well known. And
yeah, pretty fair. And then still passionate with it until old age.
Until right to the end.
But then when he left, like you said, there weren't many independent places, which is why KBank ended up working and ended up recording the Trashmen. It's kind of weird. It's almost like they had the monopoly on the weird stuff of the surf rock era, like the pre-Beatles stuff, like just Bird is the word.
Well, the surf music was a little weird inherently, but
sure, yeah, but all the stuff that's like woo and just crazy,
right. Yeah, because people were just coming out of the big band popular music era, pre the Beatles really determining song structure and pop music.
Yeah.
And then there was that stuff that was in between, rockabilly and surf music, and early and blues. Blues was coming up from the South, and they all had their forms, and then the Beatles sort of congealed all of that into what pop music was, and then it's just gone on from there. But
sure.
But so yeah, he wound up going to Chicago, and he sold it to a guy named Vern Bank.
Yeah.
And Vern already had a record pressing plant
in
North Minneapolis somewhere.
Okay, yeah.
And if you read Bruce's story or Vern's story, he talks about for tax purposes or whatever, he couldn't call it Vern Bank Studios, so he named it after his wife, and it became KBank.
KBank, yeah.
And it's really KBank, but they just took out the space between the two syllables and became one word, two syllables.
And then they had some weird deal for like $400. If a band could get $400 together, they could record here, and then you'd get them play on some radio stations, get them some bigger record company exposure. Right. stuff like that, kind of give him a good.
Well, that's his purpose in buying this was he said, I have one half of the process. I have the second half of the process. I make the records. Why don't I do the first half of the process too? I'll record the records and build my business. And, it's the old, the sum of two is greater than the two individual pieces kind of. And
He was close to being a record label.
well, yeah. And they had in Studio C, which you walked by as we were coming in. There are two studios on the further up in the building.
Sure.
Studio C is a small room, and that was where the cutting lathe was. So he had an old Scully cutting lathe in there, and so they'd record it, make the acetates, and then take it downtown and manufacture the records. So he had a whole turnkey operation, and they would offer packages like that because he could, where nobody else could do that, offer a package like that, because if there was another studio, they didn't have a cutting lathe and they didn't have a pressing plant.
Yeah, they couldn't print a bunch of 45s for you. Yeah.
Exactly. They could make a deal, but they couldn't make the deal for as cheap because they had to buy the stuff from Vern Bank,
Right.
or whoever had a pressing plant, and that person wants to make a little profit. So Vern was a smart businessman, and he decided to do the whole package.
Nice little Twin Cities monopoly. No wonder
Yeah.
everything came through here, huh?
Well, and an interesting story, and we'll bounce back to this gentleman earlier who just celebrated a birthday last week. His name was Tom Jung. And Tom was an engineer who worked at KBank, a young guy, and he was, making recordings and got to work with a young band that came down here to get the deal from Winnipeg, Canada. Burton Cummings and some other guys, somebody named Randy Bachman might have been in the band.
Cool.
And they came down, and Tom says that while they were making the record and they really liked what they got, this new song, and they were going to put out this new 45, they said, we need a new name. And they came up with the name The Guess Who,
No way.
up in Studio B. And Jung was the engineer. And so he, in theory, made the very first Guess Who recording. And this would have been probably about 1965 or something.
Crazy.
Yeah, or 66, somewhere around there. But he said, yeah, I remember the guys talking about it. Said, we need a new name. And I who do you think? And it was like somebody just came up with the joke of like, knock, knock, who's there? Guess who? Or something,
Yeah.
And they kept that name.
Cool. Up in Studio B.
In Studio B.
Oh, I recorded a little bit there 10 years ago with my buddy Glenn. Yeah. It's a cool place.
So it was KBank historically until about 1967. And then Vern wanted to get out of the business, maybe ill health or something. I'm not exactly sure of Vern's history. I have articles about it. I should have studied a little more before I did the interview here. But he sold it to a guy named John Michelson, who I think up the street a couple of blocks at maybe where Spy House Coffee Shop is right now, maybe in that building, John had a business, and he, as legend tells the story, where he sold and installed church organs, but kind of church, not organs so much, more church bells and chime systems. And he put them up in the steeple tower of a church. If somebody was building a new church or they wanted to upgrade the one bell into multiple bells or something, that was John's business. But he bought this building and from Vern Bank, and so for 2 or 3 years it was Universal Audio, and they made recordings here. And Tom Jung became more of a senior engineer here and met a young jazz piano player from Germany who was working all the clubs down on Hennepin Avenue, and his name was Herb Pilhofer. And they became good friends and said, we should really have a great studio. Let's talk Mr. Michelson into, and John really didn't want to do it. So they left and started what became known as Sound 80.
Oh, okay. Which
Not
is
at the building over in East Minneapolis, but at a film facility out in Edina or something, and they had a little space inside of a building. The origins of Sound 80.
Okay,
and
that was
then they
before,
got the deal from the city to buy that property over on 25th and built the building from scratch.
Right.
Well, so when they left, there went a big client, Herb Pilhofer, of John Michelson's, and there went his top engineer. So John kind of said, well, I'm out of here. So then he decided to sell the building. And the building went to a group of people, 3 or 4 different people, and it was called Mike Side. And Mike Side was in from late 60s to early 70s for a few years. And then that transitioned. I think one of the investors wanted out. They got another guy or two other people to invest. And that turned into what became Cookhouse. And people often remember this building as the Cookhouse studio. For many years, people would come here and say, "Oh, you're in the Cookhouse building." I said, "No, it's the Creation Audio building." But so they were here for a long time, and they made a lot of jingles that everybody is familiar with. If you're older, a lot of the young people wouldn't. But jingles for Gabbard's Furniture Store and Dairy Queen and Northwest Airlines and
Cool.
The big companies, and then a lot of the big ad agencies from downtown Minneapolis would come here and create, do their work. And they had a tape duplicate. In those days, nothing's digital, so they'd literally mass produce reel-to-reels, and you'd send out to every radio station a 30-second commercial on a 5-inch reel or on a 7-inch reel.
Crazy.
And they would play it from tape. And so there was this machine called a Magnifax, and you'd put the master hub on, and it would make 5 reel-to-reel copies simultaneously at high speed.
So you could send out your Dairy Queen jingles.
And they'd send out to 300 radio stations or something,
Cool.
all around the Midwest to play these commercials.
That's wild.
Which then transitioned into music that went out on carts and then digital. And, the evolution, as my old friend Timothy Leary liked to say to me, he said, "Evolution, she doesn't like final forms." And so the tape, the 30-second piece of tape was just a pupa stage of, what things are now.
You were buddies with Tim Leary?
I can get to that story too, yeah. But yeah, now that's interesting you would call him Tim, because that's what I call him. But
Really? Yeah. The tune in, drop out?
tune in, turn on, drop out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah, I produced a concert with him with my very good friend Steve Booker.
No way.
And we brought him 2 concerts, but the second one was pretty big, and it was a show. So we booked a show. It was February 17th, 1982. And for those of you who don't know who Timothy Leary was, he was a very famous Harvard scientist.
Acid.
Well,
LSD.
he sort of pioneered the development of the drug while being a scientist at Harvard, and used it in tests. The military was using it. They would test it on soldiers and things. And he was part of the very beginnings of lysergic acid and LSD. And, then became notorious. Richard Nixon referred to him as the most dangerous man in America.
Sure.
But we had him in. We did a concert with him at the Calhoun Beach Club. And
No
it was
way.
called An Evening with the Commodore. And An Evening with the Commodore, Timothy Leary, stand-up philosophy was how the billing was. And so he was doing comedy, he was doing funny, philosophical, conceptual, futuristic ideas, but in a humorous way.
At the Calhoun Beach, that's the last venue I'd ever expect.
At the Calhoun Beach Club, and we had a 4-piece jazz band was the opening act. And I have a wonderful recording of that is, it's amazing, going back to 1982, but talking about politics and religion and the future of science kind of. But every now and then when he was talking over the heads, the band warmed him up, and then he'd open his statement and talk about the second law of thermodynamics or something, and the crowd. And we had about 180 people that bought tickets to come see this because he was a big deal back then.
Sure, yeah.
And he'd say, "Boy, I could use a little saxophone solo about right now," because the crowd was like, "What do we make of this guy?" And then so he toned it down, and then he said, "Let me start taking some questions." And then so people would, some of the smarty pants in the audience would ask him something, and then he would answer in some way and just shut him down, because you didn't want to get into a debate with him about conceptualism or whatever, unless you were some Harvard scientist, where you could talk at his level. But he could talk to the crowd or over the crowd, above the crowd. It was very interesting. So that time, I spent a bunch of time with him, and I went out to his house in Malibu, California, and played my first ever video game with his 12-year-old son.
Cool.
And who I had no idea, and the 12-year-old son just looked at me like, what an idiot, and because he was, and there was primitive video games in 1982, but, I was slow, and how do you do this? And it's going, push that forward. Oh, okay, I get it,
Sure.
The 12-year-old.
Yeah.
But, so anyway, I digress.
Cool. Yeah, I wouldn't have expected that. Usually when you hear Tim Leary, it's in the same sentence as like Grateful Dead, Haight-Ashbury, Hunter S. Thompson.
No, there was so much more to it, and the funny stuff. But Tim told me that line about evolution because he was way ahead in his feminism at that time too, because he referred to evolution as a she. Or not an it or anything, but evolution, she doesn't like final forms. And, because the final form, there is no final form. Final form is when you die, but evolution keeps developing. And when something dies, the next thing it's born might be just a little different than the thing that died, and so.
Sure.
It goes on, but, and of course, I wouldn't agree to or deny the fact that there may have been some stimulant or unstimulant involved in the 5 days that he was in Minneapolis. But, it was a very interesting time in my life. But this recording is great because I have edited the whole evening down to segments of a song and then one of his topics, and then another song and another one of his topics, and they transition. So as the jazz tune finishes, if it was a bebop or a ballad or mid-tempo swing or whatever it might have been that the band played as an opening act, led into something that made sense, in his, hour-long
Has this been
stage
released?
performance. No, I haven't. Only a few of us have ever heard it.
We got to do another episode with the St. Paul Music Collective.
It's unbelievable. The music is so good on it because everybody was there just going, well, you don't know what to expect, but we're here with this guy that's famous. And so the four guys just played phenomenally. And then to hear him in that context, and
cool.
It's really I had it edited down to, it would fit on a 2-hour cassette, and then I had to edit it down so it would fit on a 90-minute cassette, and then to get it on a CD, had to bring it down to 80 minutes or less, and everything I took out, I went, oh, that hurts, because I want to keep this, So I have the 2-hour cassette still, and the original master, of course.
I have to live stream it sometime if you're into that.
Well, it should be released at some point. I think the world should hear this, because it's funny. He makes jokes about. He puts up on the screen. He's talking about the Pope at that time, and the original Pope John, I think, and somebody had tried to assassinate the Pope. It was in 1981 or 82 or something. And so he had we had a little kind of an AV show going on, and so he had the Pope up there, and he stopped. He said, you ever notice how much the Pope looks like Tom Landry? And Tom Landry, of course, is the famous, notorious owner now, but was the coach of the Dallas Cowboys football team. And you put the two of them next to each other, and they look very similar. I mean, that was where his humor went,
Cool.
Yeah. It was interesting because he said, who would want to shoot the Pope? And he paused, pregnant pause. Well, for starters. And then he went into his bit, and of course, the Pope, Catholics, 1.5 billion Catholics, but the rest of the world isn't, so,
right.
That's where his humor was.
So it turned into what, cooking recording studios?
So Cookhouse Studios
is what this place was.
Yeah,
in the late
and
70s.
Cookhouse stayed for quite a long time until for like 73 to about 82. There's nothing. I got this going on here, but
sure.
So
73
for about
3 to 82.
Yeah, I think so. Right around 82, 83, and then Paul Stark started a record label in the city, a punk rock, kind of early punk label called Twin Tone Records.
Paul Stark and Pete Jesperson.
And
he
Pete
keeps
Jesperson.
coming up on this show. Pete Jesperson's name's always coming up.
Right, and so they moved into the building, bought the building, and had Twin Tone Records in this facility. And then he
Replacements recorded Tim here.
a lot
Alex
of
Chilton
stuff.
was here. Husker Du recorded a bunch of
Soul
stuff here.
Asylum,
So
you know,
cool.
I mean, there was a lot of stuff of the suburbs and, you know, the Wallets. And
And that's who you bought it from.
then when I bought it, it was very interesting because there were 4 owners at the table because people were selling a building on a contract for deed or whatever. So when I sat down I moved in here in 1986 into Studio B because that room became available. Whoever was in there had moved out, and a guy named Dave All had just built out that studio, and it was Dave's first studio. He's gone on to become the sort of studio designer in the Twin Cities, but his very first room was Studio B.
Cool, that's a nice room. Smaller than this, but yeah.
It's the room itself is smaller. The control room is about this size.
Sure.
And so we sat down at the table, and there was an older gentleman, I forget his name, it was like Sid somebody, was at the table. Dale Menton, who owned Cookhouse with some other guys, but Dale was the figurehead of the facility. And then Paul Stark, and then myself. And we were there with the guy that was doing the closing. And so I handed Paul a check, Paul handed Menton a check, and Menton handed the older guy a check, all at the same time. And then all those contracts for deed were finished, and I had a mortgage on the place with my former partner, a guy named Terry Grant, who I started the business with. And
It's a good way to do business. Just one round table, everybody passes each other a check.
Yep. Each check got successively smaller. Mine was the largest one to Paul. Paul's to Dale was a little smaller. Dale to the other guy was a little smaller yet. But then I was here through 80. And it was funny because in 88, that year, then I had been working with this gentleman, Ben Sidran.
I don't understand.
Sorry, be quiet. This guy, Ben Sidran, out of Madison, Wisconsin. And Ben is very well known. And in fact, Monday night he's going to be at Dakota. But Ben and I, over the years, wound up making all or pieces of about 17 records, I think.
Cool.
And film score stuff and, you know, a bunch of things.
Paul Abdul.
But it had nothing to do with Ben Sidran. But Paul,
Okay.
I did here in Studio B when she was making her first record.
Cool.
But in 88, I was making a record with Ben, and then he came in one day, he said, well, I got news. He said, it's not going to be my record. Now, it's not going to be the next Ben Sidran record. It's going to be a Steve Miller Band record.
Wow.
And I went, oh, really? Okay. Really? You know, and it was. And so wound up finishing the record for Steve. And Ben knew Steve from Madison going back into the 60s.
Whoa.
And they had a band. It was Ben Sidran, Steve Miller, and Boz Skaggs.
No
It was
way.
a trio.
These guys are Wisconsin guys?
Well, Steve came from Dallas. He grew up in Texas, but Ben was in Madison going to school and earning his degree. And Boz, I'm not sure where Boz is from, but they had the band for a while. And then it became, Steve said he wanted to call it the Steve Miller Band, and Ben said it's because he owned the PA. So, you know, that was that. And then it eventually broke up. But interestingly, both Steve and Boz went to San Francisco then. And Ben continued his education, wound up getting his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and has written many books and has probably made 25 or 30 albums. You know, he's very well known in VH1, you know, interview shows. He was on national TV for a long time, and radio shows, and he's a great, funny, super bright, you know, old friend.
Cool.
But so then I wound up going out on the road with Steve Miller, and I made that record, and I was about 7 years, I think, mixing front of house for Steve Miller. But
cool.
That broke up my relationship with my partner back here at the business, and the business started falling apart, and so I left the band and came back, and I had gotten married. Also in 88, now in 89, I had a son growing up, and by 94, it was like, you know, my son's now 5 years old and going to go to school. I said, I got to come home. And so I quit the touring life, but that was a very exciting period of time, you know, it's because we toured big time, you know, arenas, football stadiums,
Steve
opening
Miller,
for the Grateful
man.
Dead. And
Cool.
And we played about 9 football stadiums one summer, and it was like 60,000 people, 70,000 people.
And you were running sound.
Yeah.
Oh man, that's a little stressful.
Yeah. So, well, but by that point I had done it long enough. I probably did about 275 shows or something over that period of time, and starting in theaters, but then going to doing all the sheds and then doing the big stuff, and worked with big acts, and you realize they're big acts, but they are just people in the end.
Sure.
Good band, but there are a lot of good bands, but there's just the difference between a good song and a great song is not very much, but it's that little thing that's hard to reach,
Yeah, no kidding. The ghosts.
Yeah.
There's might have played a part in that stuff.
It may have.
The ghost of this studio.
The ghost of the studio, yeah.
That's a legend here, right?
There is the legend of the ghost. It's myth to some people. Many people can't believe it, but many people have their own stories about it through the period, through each studio iteration. There's a lot of stories about it, and I had my own experiences of sensing somebody right behind me in the hallway, walking up the hallway and then going through an area that's 4 feet in the building with no air conditioning vent or anything that was 20 degrees colder than the air on either side of it. And it's like, well, that's not possible.
Right.
The ghost, and I had a client one day up in Studio B. I was mixing something, and the piano sits in another room by itself, and the client said, I'll just go in and play piano while you're setting up the mix. And so he was in there with the lights off, and all of a sudden, threw the door open, came out and said, someone else put their hands on the piano. And in the middle of the afternoon, in front of other people, he felt like while he was playing, other notes played that he didn't play.
Wow. Were they in key?
Well, yeah, he didn't go that far, but he was freaked out.
Yeah.
And you can imagine, sitting in there in the dark, you're just kind of, trying to be moody and meditative or whatever, and then something like that happens. Now, he had no idea, knew nothing about the stories about the ghost.
He just
it was
felt
just
it.
an experience that he had unsolicited, and so any of the engineers that talk about it,
they all got their ghost stories.
Yeah, very non-malicious. Never did anything outrageous, but people would hear stories like a piano playing downstairs, and they were upstairs, and they'd come downstairs and it'd be quiet, and they'd go back upstairs and they'd hear the piano again, and they're in the building by themselves. So it's myth or legend or
placebo effect. Or
it could be unique to only a few people who would accept that could happen.
Right. You got to be open enough or whatever.
Yeah. So back to the history. So 94, I leave the road. I come back here and I look around. I'm by myself, and I got this big building and 3 rooms. Like, well, where do I go? So over the last 32 years, I remodeled and changed the nature of what independent studios work like.
Sure.
You can't just do it on your own. Wasn't a big record label. I didn't have a big hit record, where I had a bunch of money that I needed to spend, otherwise I'd pay it in taxes or something.
Right.
So it became a little community here, and now the building has got fantastically amazing musicians in it, all records plastered on the wall, gold, platinum, film scores, you name it, and bands, famous bands that they worked with. And I worked with my share, after Steve Miller, and I wound up doing, the Paul Abdul record up in Studio B. Prior to that, I had made a bunch of records with Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, the last one being the first big Janet Jackson record, the Control album that I engineered on that.
And you did that here?
No, I didn't do that here. I did that before I moved in here. That was in 85, and so I moved in here in 86.
Sure.
But did that record at another facility. And that's a long story that I won't go into. That was going to be my studio before I moved in here, and then it wound up becoming the first Flight Time studio.
Oh, sure.
And not the one out by Southdale, but there was another little building just down Nicollet where they were for about 2 or 3 years.
42nd Nicollet.
4330.
Okay, right across from Driftwood Char Bar.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. I used to.
Yeah.
We used to play Driftwood. They used to say Funky Town was recorded, or Janet Jackson used to record there, or whatever.
Yeah, that's
It's
where
hard
we
to
made
believe.
the Control album.
Cool. Can we see this studio later?
Sure.
So you got Studio B and C, and different famous engineers work in there. You lease it out to them, but you run this one.
Yeah, this is where my work and other works. Tom Herbers works here frequently, and other engineers. Scott Melchow works a lot in here, and Miles Hansen, who's the front of house now for Corey Wong.
Oh, cool.
He's been doing that for a number of years, but Miles spent the beginnings and really built his career working as an assistant associate to me in this room. One of the larger rooms in the city that still exists and still can exist.
Studios are so small these days. This can still fit a choir.
Yeah, I can fit and I have about 25 orchestral musicians with a conductor and music stands and microphone stands, without getting too crowded. I could probably squeeze 30 in, it would be tight.
Yeah.
But 25 I've had in here, and choirs, I've had 30, 40 voice choirs in here without being too crowded. I've done performances where I've had like a solo pianist come and then, invited guests, and it had as many as 70 people sitting on chairs or standing with the piano right in the center.
Jeez.
This great French pianist. And we did an in the round thing. Actually, he was English pianist. Tony Hymas was his name. And Tony was the keyboard player with Jeff Beck for about 35 years. But
way.
he was a fantastic classical pianist. Like child genius, prodigy, classical pianist.
Sure.
But he played keyboard with Beck, where he would be doing, right hand, mid-range harmony stuff, left hand bass.
Sure.
And he was a genius, still is. Tony's, but he's an older gentleman now. But so we set him up right in the center of the room, and had people all around him, and he played Haydn etudes or something, like 12 of them, just off the top of his head, just played them.
Cool.
But he said when I was 16, I was exposed to jazz, and he said it changed my life. But prior to that, he was a young child classical pianist, a prodigy.
Cool. And then just got in more into the creative stuff with the jazz.
Well, not the classical isn't creative, but yeah,
Right,
he got
right.
into more improvisation rather than reading the written page,
That's a hard leap for a lot of people.
Yeah.
A lot
A lot of people
make
can't
it.
do that. A lot of the
No.
classical musicians can't improvise. They panic.
Right.
If you say make something up.
It's so strange because they're so talented, but you
Yeah.
get in a room to jam with them.
Yeah,
and
an
it's just,
unbelievable technique, but they can't free their mind from the ink.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, but it's getting to be less so now, just as evolution, changes and people keep growing. The young people coming up in classical music now are not afraid of that, or they love to try and improvise something and have both of those skills, to be able to play free or play from memory, and then change things harmonically, reharmonize some of the great music. But when they can look at a page, they can play it verbatim, just as the composer wanted it.
I wish I knew how to read better. I could use this.
It's a great skill.
Sure.
That's my Yamaha C7D that I've owned now since January of '80. So it's in its 47th year with me. I bought it new. It's been beautifully maintained and recorded on hundreds and hundreds of recordings and, album CD projects. And
Cool. You don't see that many grand pianos in studios anymore.
well, 9-footers you don't see a lot of because they're just so expensive. But
Hard to haul.
yeah, well, and they can, movers. I had a 9-foot in just about a month ago, a rental from Schmidt Music, and they brought the piano in. 3 guys brought it in. They pulled the truck up in the back, and it's up on its side. The legs are off it, and it's on a dolly, and they just rolled it in. They bolt the legs on, and then they just gradually just tip it over onto the legs. And the lyre, they bolt that on, and get it down on the ground. And when they take the piano out, they just tip it up and unbolt the legs and roll it out.
And then and then
And that weighs, a 9-foot grand piano weighs like 900 pounds or something. It's a beast.
Yeah.
And if you got to bounce it over a door threshold and down a step, and then you see them getting it up on the back of a lift gate on a truck.
Yeah.
And those lift gates always kind of slope down just a little bit.
Sure.
It seems like they're never flat or slope in. And you see that piano standing on that thing, and I went, that looks so sketchy, that could just start to roll. And you try to stop it, and it's about this high on the thing. What if it went like that, and it's 4 feet off the ground,
Kill a couple people, yeah.
Oh, man. Or just destroy a $150,000 piano.
Oh, man. Jeez.
So, yeah, this is Studio A, performance space. And
beautiful.
It's just always in, as you see around the room, it's in some state of having just been used. So nothing ever gets put away. It just gets pushed to the side, and so you can just grab whatever you need.
Cool. So with all these mics and this equipment, you were saying before that after being in the game so long, you're not really an equipment guy.
Well,
or you're a little agnostic in it and a little atheist.
Yeah, microphones. I have a lot of different microphones. I probably have over 100 microphones.
Great collection.
A great collection of new microphones and old microphones. And then you realize, okay, I could get another new microphone. It would sound very much like this other new generation microphone. And things don't sound that much different. And you realize, I realized that there's 100 different mic preamps you can buy.
Yeah.
And all of them will say, yeah, we have no distortion and we're flat from 10 hertz to 40 kilohertz or something. And they all maybe sound a little bit different, but in the end, it really doesn't make any difference in terms of if you think this piece of gear is going to make me closer to a hit record.
Right.
Because it's not. Because unless somebody can really sing and they're standing in front of the microphone, you can put them in front of an SM57 or you can put them in front of a U47 Neumann. They can give you an incredible performance on a 57. That's what's going to sell the record.
Right.
If the lyrics are fabulous, if the melody catches somebody and really creates an emotion in that person, that person doesn't care if it was recorded on a U47 or a Shure SM57 that costs $75 and is kind of beat up. It doesn't make any difference to the listener because they feel that performance, and that's the intangible part about recording music. So you realize once it gets good enough, then it's good enough.
Sure.
It's because what you're really trying to do is capture a musical performance to make a recording out of, and for all time. And therein requires a little engineering, a little psychology, a little philosophy, whatever.
Sure.
To pull out of the performer if they're struggling, or they go, "What do you think? What should I do?" And you give them an idea that's, "Yeah, let me try that," and then you got something better. That's what counts. Doesn't make any difference what preamp you're coming through.
Right.
You can, for your own benefit, go, "Yeah, I really like this tube saturation or this or that," but that doesn't make a difference to the performance. If he or she is wearing headphones and they're feeling it and they're giving it back to you, that's what counts.
Right.
So, the old adage of shit in, shit out. Sorry if I'm,
No, it doesn't matter. No, it makes total sense. After a certain point, it's just consumerism nonsense, right?
Yeah. It comes down to the source always, and you realize that once you have enough stuff. Now, because I can put an orchestra in here, I've got to have 25 music stands, and I have to have enough microphones and headphones and things to do all that stuff. And sometimes you look at it, you go, well, if I use a condenser mic on the first violins, but I've got seconds, violas, and cellos, maybe I'll work my way down to a dynamic on the cello just to give me a little more contrast. And you use the different microphones for different things.
Right.
They make more difference than everything beyond them. It kind of, when they call it the gain change, it comes how the volume being emitted by the instrument or the singer, and then the microphone. This has the most difference. The microphone has the second most difference. And as it goes down the chain, there are diminishing differences in one preamp to another preamp, one console to another console, digital recording, analog recording, whatever it might be. The biggest differences are the first two links in the chain.
Sure.
Is the performer and the microphone. So, and microphones do have more variations in their timbre and quality, just like instruments do. Preamps really don't. They're microscopic differences.
Minute, sure.
Yeah,
Sure.
in them. And one console to another console, people always rave about, well, the big consoles were used because big artists who were really good went to the places that were fancy, so they had an SSL and they had Neve and all that stuff. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I can record on my Sony console and I have made great, fabulous recordings.
4-track Tascam.
I started with 4-track, went to 8, went to 16, went to 24-track analog, went to 24-track digital, went from 24-track digital down to ADATs,
Sure.
which stored 8 tracks on VHS tapes, 16-bit, then 20-bit, and then to computers. And I made great recordings on all of them. I listen to some of my old 8-track stuff. I go, God, this feels really good.
Sure.
And it's convenience to me now. What's the most convenient? I can do what I need to do. I can, come in, go to work, leave. Get
Sure.
the work done.
Like you said before, it has a lot to do with workflow though, and like making decisions.
Right.
Like, because these days, like we were saying, oh, we'll fix it all in post.
Right.
And that becomes kind of a mantra people say.
Nowadays.
Nowadays, which takes away from the original performance being the
Yeah.
thing, like you were just saying.
Yeah, the performance. I mean, when you were working on small format analog, everything you did was destructive.
Right.
There was no non-destructive editing. If you punched in, it was destructive. And
You were saying Paula Abdul had trouble with her S's and stuff like that, and yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, Paula wasn't a singer. She was very talented, but
Dancer.
there were she said, I'm not a singer, I'm a dancer. But she had a record deal, and we worked here with her, and the three qualities that everybody needs to get, or at least in my era of coming up, was pitch, pocket, and pronunciation. You had to be able to understand what was being said. You had to, sing it in good rhythm. You could, dragging, rushing. You had to get it in the pocket, make it feel right, and sing it in tune. And Paula would be, as working with her, we'd get one, then we'd get two, and then we'd get the third one, but we'd lose the first one. And it was like, shit, now what? And then finally we'd get, all three of them, and she sounds great. I need to get an S on the end of that. And so you got really good at punching in and out, because recording hers wasn't on a computer, it was destructive recording. And so to try and get in and out of record, in a hundredth of a second, or in less than a tenth of a second, how fast can you tap in, tap out, and still feel where she was going to place her S. It's like, I know where the S is on the tape. And if she sings early, I'm not going to get it. But if I go in early, I'm going to destroy what I have. So you just stay there, and you just mentally will her to sing in the right place, and then she'd get it,
Cool.
So that was a lot of work. But now those kind of skills have turned into other skills, and the ability to use a computer and get the most out of that, because nothing is destructive. You can always recall something. New playlist.
Right.
You go in to record early, you said, oops, yeah, and then you just drag the waveform forward a little bit, and now it's back to where it was. And, it's just a whole different way of working.
Right. Which
And you
messes with
lose,
the
actually, I
performance.
miss the old way of doing it, because
That's the thing, workflow.
well, it's a workflow, but it's your involvement in the song itself that you're working on. You're more involved in the technology. You can do this and that, and just don't worry about it. I got everything I need. I'll just fix it up, tune it, slide it over, stretch it, shrink it, do whatever you need to do. In the old days, it's like, no, you were really there with the performer. He said, you're just rushing a little bit. Let's go in and get one more, and And you'd go in to record and you'd punch in, punch out, and you go, okay. And punching in, punching out was the new process. It didn't used to be able to do that. But when you could do that, that was the thing. But you had to be really accurate because you could mess something up. And
Sure.
And, you know, there are a lot of stories about people making mistakes, thinking they were going to go in to record on one channel and they'd punch in and everything would go off.
Oh.
And you realize, oh, I forgot to take all the other channels out of record.
Oh.
I mean, there are stories about that. Every engineer in those days has his stories.
Oh, I run into that on the 4-track cassette machine that I'm
Sure.
using.
Yeah.
You ruin everything. Yeah.
Well, so anyway, I feel like I'm just going blah, blah, blah on your show here. So,
No,
you know,
no, this is great.
I talk a lot about things.
I appreciate you.
But so here's the big room. There's a drum booth over here that, or, you know, it's drum booth or whatever, an isolation room. And it gets used, you know, horns and whatever, singers, and depends. And I have another small ISO booth on the other side. Very old school, 80s kind of decor. It's a blue collar working studio.
Beautiful. Well, thanks for the interview. Thanks
Yeah.
for showing me around.
Well, Creation Audio has been here now since 1988 in this facility, and I've seen Nicollet Avenue change, go through a lot,
I bet. Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks a lot, man.
You're very welcome, Elliot. Thank you for the opportunity.
Appreciate
I hope you all enjoyed it.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks. Have a good night, guys. Thanks for tuning in.